So good.
How are you doing this evening?
Great, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, obviously, this is not the home of NYU. So what brought you out to the Bay?
Oh, family brings me out to the Bay. Just brings me out to the Bay.
Awesome.
It's always good coming to San Francisco.
Excellent. All right, so let's go ahead and just dive right in. And I was sharing with a couple of our guests that your book is not, at least for me, it's not light everyday reading. And so I have my notes and I will be referring to them, but I think the topic is so incredibly important right now that we have to have this conversation. So just to tell us a little bit about yourself, one of the things, your bio begins with the sentence, David Elcott works at the intersection of community building, cross-boundary engagement, and interfaith and ethnic organizing and activism. Tell us a little bit about life at that intersection.
So it's been a long time of realizing that I personally, in my own life and in my perspective, cross a lot of boundaries that are unexpected. And it's a little bit of what I'll be talking about this evening as well, of meeting communities, individuals, values, cultures that are different from mine, and how do I connect? So that's part of it. And part of it is just mediating conflict. So I've spent time traveling in the Middle East, trying unsuccessfully, trying to have impact there. I worked with there was a strange dispute between the Church of Latter-day Saints and the Jewish community of Populist baptism.
Yes.
So I was the mediator that brought them together and helped them actually negotiate a settlement. So that's part of it. And part of it is the realization that even as religious observance and religious affiliation drops in the world, religious identity is actually expanding. And that is what drove the book, which we'll talk about, some.
That's actually a fascinating point because as a percentage of the population, the percentage of people who identify with a particular community has declined, but it seems like those who are still in it are more, they're clinging more.
The key word here is identity. We'll talk. Let me step back though a bit to make sense of that. So, and I'll probably get some pushback because there'll be some discomfort with my analysis here, but I think it's really important to understand what's happening by the very people that most of us absolutely don't understand at all. I mean, they're unfathomable, their behaviors, their choices, right? And this is San Francisco, so it's even more so. So a couple of things that kind of ground me in the work that I've been doing. One is the nature of democracy itself. So the book is talking about liberal democracy. But when we think of democracy, democracy plays itself out in a variety of ways. One way is simple, majority rule, right? And there's a piece of us, like when we were little kids, the teacher would say, do you want to play outside or inside? And the kids were voting, and they knew in kindergarten already, raise their hand and the majority will. But we in America have a different notion of democracy, which is about protection of human and civil rights, of individual rights, the 10 amendments to the Constitution, some of which we think are very real, like freedom of speech, and some of them we don't understand, like the Second Amendment. Why should people, if they have guns, they can kill everybody, and somehow that's freedom. But there is this other notion, which is democracy only functions when those who are most marginalized, those who are most oppressed, that they are protected as well. So it's the second notion of democracy. And a third notion of democracy is a community comes together by something they share, values, culture, an identity that they share. And in America, we presume that that's coherent. So we presume that the majority, which will allow for the minority to have rights, but in America is fundamentally white, Christian, heteronormative. That's the what we call the unmarked position, the norm in this country. And we presume that while others can live within America, they're kind of, it's kind of a white Christian country. And you got to kind of accept that. And we presumed it would work. But post-World War II, whether it was in the United States or another place in the world, democracy began pushing more and more for individual rights. And that threatened the sense of cultural integrity of the nation. And so part of what we're seeing is a rebellion against us, probably most of us sitting in this room, a rebellion against the idea that we're all global citizens, that we all we all can hold hands and join each other in respect and love, and particularly protecting the rights of those who are marginalized. So there is a significant portion of the American population, of the German population, of the French population, of the Indian population, the Burmese, Myanmar population, the Indonesian population, which says, wait a moment, why are these people in America, African Americans, or gays, or Jews, or illegal people coming in this country, why do they jump in line ahead of me? Why do everybody's still talking about them, what about me? And so you get a reaction which is rather dramatic. It is the reaction that says, wait a moment, my interest, if we're talking about identities and we're talking about marginalized, I feel marginalized. I'm a white, Christian, poor, and I'm marginalized. And actually, although you think I should vote my economic interest, I'm voting a different interest. I'm voting the interest of my identity. And that identity, while it's Christian, doesn't mean that it's Christian. It means that Christmas is Christmas, and Santa Claus is a white guy with a white beard. That's just the way the world is. And I don't have to go to church to feel that my identity is threatened. And that's the same in Germany. And in India, that is what the Hindus, what Modi is doing in India. And in Indonesia, when the Christian mayor of Jakarta speaks and is accused of, he's Christian in a Muslim country, he's accused of blasphemy and put in jail for as a blasphemer. I mean, he's the mayor of Jakarta. And Muslims are being murdered in Myanmar, right? In Myanmar by Buddhists, because we don't want the Buddhists to get away from thinking all they do is meditate and are very sweet and calm. They're murdering people as well. It's actually wonderful. It's very egalitarian. All the religious communities are doing terrible things to others in the world, but it's not about religion. It's about identity. And that's what confuses us. That's why we don't understand. So that's the first thing. We're misunderstanding democracy. For these Americans that we don't understand, they say, we are the majority in this country. This is a white Christian country. You have the right to live here. You have the right to be here, that's fine. But don't take away our culture from us. Don't take away our values from us. Don't take away the world that is normative to us. That's a really critical point here. The other is, I've spent a lot of time talking to these people. My research was going down to Vidalia, Georgia. Does anybody know what Vidalia, Georgia?
I do. I'm from Georgia.
So what is Vidalia, Georgia's great contribution to the world?
Vidalia onions.
Vidalia
are the
onions.
most delicious onions.
Right.
you'll ever
And that's it. You go to Vidalia, Georgia, and there is nothing but onions. When I left there, I took all my clothes, stuffed them in a bag, and put in my suitcase 25 pounds of Vidalia onions.
You can grab a 50
Right?
pound bag.
Absolutely. And I talked, but I was interviewing in communities in the South, evangelical communities and conservative Catholic communities. And they're not stupid. They're not stupid. And that's part of our problem. We think they're stupid. They're not. They're saying the same things that we're saying. For many of us, we are economically stable. We are part of the ethnic majority. And yet we will vote our interests, which are to care about a diverse, equitable society, right? We'll vote against our own interests. And we'll even support an adulterer who has sex with a intern, and we're going to vote for him for president again because on balance, it's worth it because of what he can do. I mean, what we felt, right, for those of us who are progressive felt he could do. Well, they're saying the same thing. They're saying, wait a moment, we're voting our values. We understand that it's not, we're not voting our economics. We're voting our values, which are America is a God-blessed country.
So that I a little bit of pushback.
Yeah.
Because to your point, I mean, right now, what impeachment is showing the American Crime Story series, so we all get to relive this if we choose. I would imagine those who made that choice in the 90s, when they spoke of voting their values, religion and all of the ritual and principle and just the solemnity was not associated with those values. These were almost a very sort of rational, yet heartfelt, thoughtful, this is what this country represents. The people that you're talking about today, they drape themselves in the cloak of Jesus, but they can't quote anything. And if that's your choice, that's fine. But it presents a very clear marker of falling short. Do you see what I'm saying? So I don't think it's.
Yeah. We have that picture of Donald Trump holding the Bible upside down, knowing that he couldn't quote a sentence from that Bible, right? And yet, it had enormous power for a certain community. Look, the data that we're finding is, particularly, for example, in Germany, the more church-going you are, the less likely you're going to vote for the AfD. AfD is the right-wing party in Germany. The less likely you will vote. The more Catholic observant you are in Italy, the less likely you will vote for a right-wing party. And it turns out that the more church-going crowd in America did not support Trump. Not at all of the numbers of those who call themselves evangelicals. So now we have to pose the question, who are those people and why do we misunderstand them? Meaning, we think that they're all hypocrites because they're saying the name of Jesus, but they're not behaving that way. But that was my argument, that we had very strong views on misogyny, but we voted for Clinton anyway.
I mean, but words have meaning. So if someone is defining themselves, like I vote my values, I'm a white Christian, you are inviting people to say, okay, the dictionary tells me this, Google says, and yet you're making decisions that run counter to the very definition.
Your definition could not their definition of Christianity. Christianity is triumphant. Christianity conquered the world. Christianity, there's a war between satanic forces. I often think that I am understood as a satanic force, and the liberating forces of Christianity. Look, that understanding is not new to us, because those of us who grew up in this country know that the founders of this country saw this as the new Zion, as the new Israel, and that God blesses this country, and that God will, it tells us right in the Bible, that when people sin, when the community sins, God will evacuate. So I don't have to be a deeply observant Christian, or for that matter, a deeply observant Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or Jew in Israel. I mean, think about the same thing in Israel. Netanyahu, married for the third time, a public adulterer, not observant at all, but he had the support of the right-wing Orthodox, using not Judaism but Jewish identity. Right, so that's the first, but I'm not actually done with mine. The other thing is that we all talk about the separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson spoke about that at the turn, the orange of the country. Within 25 years of establishment of the country, it was very clear that the First Amendment is a separation of church and state, but it never existed, at least not until the 1940s. And for about 50 years, the courts mandated separation of church and state. No religion in school, no prayer in school, no. And you know what? In that case, Christians, non-observant Christians, well, so wait a moment, hey, you're taking this away from us. you're taking our country away from us. This you can't do that. Why? And Potter Stewart, early on, Potter Stewart, early on said, this is in a minority, in a dissent. He said, this is going to fail, that you cannot privilege everything but religion. And sure enough, we're seeing our courts doing that day after day. They're passing on the basis of religious freedom. They are passing essentially the right to discriminate in the name of religion. So that's the second area that we misunderstood, because after World War II, all of us were brought up in that type of world. But it turns out that was a brief period of world history. And we are seeing the reassertion of religious identity as the vehicle that's driving the nationalist populist revolt. So that's the second area that I think most of us, one, our understanding of democracy, two, our understanding of religious identity, three, our understanding of church-state separation. And all of those things go against the norms that on the whole, the communities do my speak, right? The academic world, the progressive world, that we just don't get that at all. And the fourth is the magnitude of this rebellion against global elites, this rebellion against that I can take my passport, I can travel anywhere, I can go anywhere, I can speak in conferences in different places. More than half this country doesn't have a passport, never had a passport, never left this country. And for them, they feel we are the full beneficiaries of this new world in which they are losing more and more and more. Essentially back to that notion of standing in line patiently to make it. And they're just being pushed further and further behind. And so there is a revolt against me, against us, against Manny's, against San Francisco, against this sense that we are an everywhere culture, and so much of the country is not. And that's why we should have seen this coming, that in the Latino identified community and within the Black identified community, we actually saw an increase in the numbers of people voting for Donald Trump in 2020. Right? An increase in the numbers, and in the male population, actually a percentage increase, which should be on one hand unfathomable to us, but maybe now we understand a little bit better, because essentially Black community, Hispanic community, Latino community are pretty conservative in many ways. And when we talk about defunding the police, a lot of Black folk in the Bronx or in Detroit, maybe even in Oakland, are saying, wait a moment, defunding the police sounds very nice for you living in your fancy homes that are protected, but it doesn't sound safe to us. So we see all of this convergence. And I guess the reason for the book, one, is to get us to understand this. That's the first part of the book. But the second part of the book says, wait a moment, this is actually undermining democracy. And we are at a pivotal moment in which, as a betting man, I wouldn't invest my money in American democracy right now, or in Indian democracy or Indonesian democracy, the countries that had a history of democracy. I wouldn't put my money in it, because I think our institutions presume a shared set of values and normative behaviors, and they're lacking.
So, okay, so much to process there.
With that, I'm gonna have a
Please do.
drink of wine.
Because obviously the great American experiment, this is a vast, massive country. And so it's already unique amongst Western countries. To your point, the idea that over half of the country has never had a passport. I'm sure those of us who know people in Europe, they're like, what is wrong with you all? Are there elements of what you've studied and seen in America that make us uniquely susceptible to this undermining that you talk about?
Let's start from no, we're an immigrant country. We're not France, in which there is a strong culture hundreds and hundreds of years, and in which the French language is pristine. We're not Spain, even with its country, with a long imperial history. We're America, in which almost nobody can claim, that they're indigenous. Even the indigenous population knew that they came from someplace else as well. So on one hand, these shouldn't be issues. We're all immigrants, we're all other. So that brings us together, not any one particular culture, but what brings us together is this immigrant experience. It's coming into this country, I'm first generation, some of the people here may be first generation American as well. Many of us came fleeing for our lives. Many others came enslaved, forced to be here, but in a sense, all of us come from someplace else. So on one hand, the answer should be, and that was post-World War II. That was the vision. We were a democracy. We were a beacon to the world. The trouble is that for a significant portion of the population, their understanding of that was of America as a redeemed Christian nation, as a God loves this country. That's what the experiment was. And I mean, bluntly, if two guys want to have sex in their bedroom, we think that's wrong, but when the country, when the government sanctions it, when it sacralizes, when it gives, makes it holy by allowing for marriage equality, that sin is so deep that God's going to leave the country. And when you look at just today, you may have noted or heard, the Pope meeting Biden and the Catholic bishops in the United States saying, we're not giving that guy communion, right? That's the Catholic Church here, evangelical churches here are saying, you're taking, we're going to lose our country. And look, you can privately do the stuff you want to do publicly. We've got to be a Christian country. So no, the vision of America is everyone is welcome, but they're welcome under certain terms. In a sense, you and I, if you're Black, if you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, right? You can be here, but don't exaggerate your role and the role that you have and the rights that you have.
So what's kind of fascinating to me right now, one, as you talk, I keep seeing France and the battle that they're having around with their growing Muslim community and the hijabs and all the restrictions. But I'm also, you're using the word religion, religious, but to my mind, I'm hearing whiteness because again, I'll be facetious, but their junior savior, Donald Trump, far from a paragon of any value, lacking any sort of empathy. If we go through the top 10 list of Christianity or Catholicism, he's not checking a single box. And yet he is being held up. We look at the recent study of, is it Liberty University, the Falwell Institution, where students-
Former Falwell.
Yes, were discouraged from reporting sexual assault and told if you report, you are subject to expulsion because how dare you have had sex? Like just this ass backwards approach to everything. So are we talking here again in the US about religion? Or are we talking about whiteness?
So I would say, yeah, except we're seeing the same phenomenon in India. We're seeing the same phenomenon in Africa. We're seeing the same phenomenon in Asia, meaning I would say, yeah, if we weren't seeing this played out in other identities, right? So yeah, in America, let me say it differently. If we bring it only to the issues of whiteness, then I think those of us who hold progressive values are going to lose. Right? If that's the only way that we can speak about, if we only can talk about, one of my colleagues, my son who's sitting back there, we were talking about that. It's a slightly different issue. If I'm speaking to a progressive community, I would say we may be making a big mistake. I've become, in my old age, I've become more Marxist. And beginning to think that focusing on identity is going to be a dead end for us, because focusing identity mobilizes a white population. Say, okay, Black is beautiful, brown is beautiful, Asian is beautiful. I mean, Asian is if it's one thing, right? So white's beautiful too. And you know what? We're plurality, so we're gonna play a game. But if we could really find a way to seriously talk about class, suddenly white population and Black population and brown, they suddenly have something in common. In fact, I would argue that white identity has been used to undermine bringing together various groups that are actually economically.
Oh, I would absolutely agree.
Right, in which case, maybe the progressive world, and you know, remember Bernie Sanders was really interesting. He was critiqued for not being race conscious enough. He talked about economics, but maybe he had a point there, which is we're gonna lose the battle if the battle is only identity. If you noticed in Virginia, they say that the Republican candidate for governor his argument is about cancel culture. They're going into our schools and they're teaching critical race theory, and they're undermining patriotism. We're going to lose. We're going to lose if that becomes the area of conflict. We're going to lose that because there is a great ethos of fidelity, of connection, and value our team and our group. And if the white population in the whole center of the country feels that their identity is being only as victimizer, only as evil, we're gonna lose.
So then,
Just pragmatically, that's not ideological, just pragmatically, we have to rethink the way we're speaking.
okay. Wow. So one of the things that I always find interesting is obviously this is a conversation that's being had in the major metropolitan areas and hopefully in those smaller areas as well around the country. So much, it seems to happen like after Trump was elected, even after Bush 2 was elected, there is this forensic accounting, if you will, like where did we go wrong? What must we as progressives and liberals do? And it always seems to fall on like, okay, guys, now it's time to double down and fix it. You know, Bernie, you shouldn't have done that. Are you suggesting that that is the right approach, that the burden to resolve this is on those of us who envision a truly more perfect union, or can we toss some responsibility to the people who you've written about?
I want to win. I want to win. You know, it's just really pragmatically simple. I want to win. I'm not an ideologue that way. I am an ideologue on the issue of democracy, which really is the foundation of the book, which is the democratic institutions that exist in this country that protect us are incredibly vulnerable. We saw in 4 years the amount of damage that can be done to those institutions. And if those institutions fail, we have no protection. There is no capacity of democracy without some shared set of norms, and that is blown apart entirely. So my fear is a fear for democracy itself, liberal democracy as we understand it in our country and around the world. So for me at this point, it's highly pragmatic. How are we going to be able to ensure and sustain our democracy? One of the ironies is the second part of my book.
We'll have copies available for sale
The
afterwards.
second part of this book claims that even though religious affiliation wanes, religious identity is actually unbelievably powerful. More than 80% of this country has strong religious identities, not practice, not affiliation. They never go to church, but they strongly identify. So we need to, so what the book calls for is for faith communities to develop theologies of democracy.
Okay, let's elaborate on that.
So obviously the history of most religions, certainly Western religions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity is very totalitarian. We have the only truth. We are the word of God. And the argument of the book is that religion doesn't need to play that way, that actually to claim that I know what God wants is a form of idolatry, it's a form of blasphemy. We have to be more modest. And modesty is what democracy is about. Democracy says, look, I believe this, I'm going to fight for this, but if you win the election, I'm going to accept that. I have to accept that there are other views than my view. Religion has to be able to do the same. And so there needs to be a pushback against the evangelical claims, the right-wing Catholic claims, the right-wing Jewish and Muslim claims that we have absolute knowledge, which creates often the pairing with evangelicals and the Republican Party, right-wing Catholics in the Republican Party, right-wing Jews in the Republican Party, that we've got to offer an alternative, a democratic theology, and that needs to develop authentically within each religious community. So basically the book says that many religious leaders are sitting this democracy battle out. They're afraid that they speak out in a congregation, there's disagreement. So we shouldn't talk about that. And I'm saying the opposite, that synagogues and churches and mosques and temples need to mobilize in defense of democracy. And even though, a good chunk of this country isn't churched in that sense, religious leaders speaking out really do.
But there are examples of that happening. I mean, you look at the Black community, and the church historically has been the organizer, really, I dare say, leading the charge to defend democracy. But because to your point earlier, yes, socially, the African American community, I would agree, tends to, particularly older generation, tends to be pretty conservative. But when it comes to voting, one, we vote, and two, we vote for our interests, which don't always align with those conservative social norms.
Let me remind you that in California, Proposition 8, which was a constitutional amendment to prohibit same-sex marriage equality, got a majority of the Black vote and Hispanic vote in the state, and would not have won. It was funded by the Mormon Church, but it wouldn't have won without the Black and Hispanic vote. We're complicated, as I said. More Black men and Hispanic men voted for Trump in 2020 than in 2016. Ironically, if I ask you what religious groups are the most politically active in the United States, people think of evangelicals, it's Jews and African Americans. Those are the two groups that are most politically active and overwhelmingly progressive, right? So that's good, but I got all these, the majority of white Christians in this country voted for Donald Trump. And that's a problem for us. And we have to understand that and respond to that and have a way to speak to them. As I said, that calls for theologians, that calls for religious leaders to understand that their religious life is in jeopardy in a country that doesn't have democracy.
Are there any leaders who come to mind or examples?
They had, my partners, the head of the National Council of Churches, which is all the Protestant and Orthodox churches in America, Jim Winkler, extraordinary man, Democrat, that many of the seminaries are run. Catherine Henderson, who's just retired from Auburn, one of the great activist seminaries. By the way, evangelical leaders, the former vice president of the National Association of Evangelicals, left the job because he was, but he fights on the same issue principles. Look, I've got one of my colleagues in the South, Tony Ritchie, is a bishop of the Church of God. They speak in tongues. I mean, there is a right wing. There is right, but when it comes to the issue of democracy, he's going to fight tooth and nail on this issue. He may vote for Trump, but he may, support many of the conservative values, but not on the issue of democracy. And I think that is something where we could be more articulate, as opposed to assaulting those people with whom we disagree on so many issues, to push on the issue of democracy itself. That and that the vote against Donald Trump is not only on the issue of policies, it's on the issue of understanding that he undermines democracy. That Christian identity which he's promoting is antithetical to Christianity. But you and I can't say that. You need church leaders to say that is not Christian to speak that way.
Yes, and wow, I think I'm kind of fast right now, but no, because like I hear you, and yes, I understand that, but we also see in the news, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention, when some of the leadership attempted to have that conversation, the bravado that now is this toxic bravado that is now a part and aligned with leadership in so many of these faith groups, they were drowned out. I mean, we look at, I forget the gentleman, he wrote Prayer of Jabez, and he also tried to start a movement, Red Letter Christians, where he was advocating that true Christian faith should be driven by what we presume to be the literal words of Jesus the Christ. And he's been drowned out by the likes of Franklin Graham. And so it's disheartening a little bit, but I want to not walk away with that. I certainly don't want our audience walking away with that. So what is something hopeful from this? Like, where are you seeing hopeful notes of change and progress?
I said to my daughter, I hope I'm not asked that question. I honestly think we are in a liberal moment in American history, world history. We were lulled post-World War II, actually from World War I and World War II, the devastation was so massive, that pain was so massive that it kind of anesthetized the conflicts that we're talking about in America, across the world, and the United Nations and all the proclamations about freedoms. It anesthetized us that underneath this simmering was occurring, and this simmering burst forth. Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, right, in which he said that's it, liberal democracy is one, capitalism is one, and it's over. There's no more history to be had. It was wrong, and Nietzsche was wrong. God is not dead. God is, God is getting beaten up. God is getting beaten up. But so I would say communities like ours here needs not to look at it and say what's wrong with us, but rather say we need to reach out and communicate with people who are fundamentally good people. They take care of their kids, they pay their taxes, by the way, much more than people down south of San Francisco pay their fair taxes. They are generous to their fellow human beings. They have church functions and school functions. They join PTAs. They're not evil people. They just feel deeply, deeply neglected. I know you've heard this language that the increase in what's called deaths of despair, alcoholism, suicide, addiction, depression, has caused for the first time in American history, except before the pandemic, a diminution of longevity in poor whites of all age groups. Guys, we gotta have some empathetic response. But there's a quote. I'm gonna read you a quote of how we talk about that.
While we go ahead and prime your questions.
Yeah.
All right.
It's an amazing quote, in which a writer writes.
Hold your mic up so the Zoom guys can hear you too.
Yeah, it's a great quote in which he writes. He said, "We shouldn't feel sorry for them. They vote for Donald Trump as a cell, and so is OxyContin, and they could all die." And this was in a major periodical in the United States. And that's kind of our view. We heard it from Hillary Clinton in the way that she talked about this community, this population. And look, they are fellow citizens. So it's a weird thing. I do everything I can to fight against them politically. But I also have to tell you, I went to Southern churches. I have a benefit. See, I could say in Southern churches, they say, well, what about me? And I said, well, actually, I read the Bible in the original. That was all they needed to hear. They wanted me to preach. So I preached gospel to them. I mean, from the Jewish Bible and from the first part, the Bible, not the Christian Bible. But I read sections and there was modesty on their side saying, okay, you get it. Maybe we need to see the world somewhat differently. So I just think we have work to do. Because otherwise we're gonna lose. I mean, it's that simple. Otherwise we're gonna lose. And it's worse in other countries. In Israel, there is simply no longer a liberal wing of the country. It just doesn't exist anymore. In India, within the Hindu community, there is no longer the Gandhian Hinduism. In Myanmar, there is no, think of the lady, the woman who won a Nobel Prize, right, supported the destruction of the Rohingya. Right? She could not speak out against it. So this we are a minority. And our understanding of the way the world should be is a minority. But when you're a minority, either you gotta hunker down and hope you can protect yourself, or you gotta go out and proselytize. And that's what we need to be doing. We need to be proselytizing for democracy.
Thank you. So you had two hands up, then you, and then the lovely lady in the back. So go ahead, sir.
So first,
What's your name?
Peter Gisela.
Hi, Peter.
After the event, I want to tell you a funny story about my experience in Georgia.
I'm from Atlanta, which is a little
Right.
different.
I know. But it's related to all this gestalt that we're talking about. Okay, two questions. One has to do with democracy and a solution, and one has to do with the human ego and how it is connected to religious belief systems. All right, the ego one is easier. 44 years ago, I moved to San Jose, and I had a fortunate opportunity to encounter a professor at San Jose State that had just written his epos book on the human consciousness, and it combined phenomenology, existentialism, and 30 years of humanistic psychology. And I had 40-hour summer class with him and totally blown away. One of his key ideas was when babies are born, they have what he calls a transcendental ego. And then when they turn 2, 3, 4, 5, they start developing what he called an empirical ego. I call it personality ego. What happens in most cultures, they lose track of the fact that they have a transcendental ego and they fully identify with their personality ego. Now, religious leaders find that balance between the two. Meditation allows you to possibly find that balance between the two. And what happens with all these religious groups is if they don't find the balance, their ego justifies whatever actions that wants to take. And also the ego knows that it's an artificial existence, was created. And so it knows that it has a death moment. And so it gets really paranoid and anxiety. Now, democracy, I'm a Vietnam era veteran interested in democracy. At the same time, I learned of a bill in the Congress that would have proposed all youth across the country part of a federal national security program between age 17 and 18, considering their local communities, civic education and civic values in talks structured by the local community, and be encouraged to volunteer for nonprofit work, AmeriCorps-like programs, or military. It went nowhere. And this year, strangely, some Republicans and Democrats agreed that in 2023, women will have to join men in registering for the military draft. Now, nobody's talking about a draft. They're just talking about signing a piece of paper, but it's going to be all the women across the country that are 18. Next year, I hope that interested entities in democracy see this event in 2023 as a means to have a national dialogue on what is civic values. Problem is, I've been talking to them for 40 years and they all don't want to talk to me.
So look, going back to human nature. Societies depend on certain ways that members of society connect. There are certain core values that kind of behavioral evolutionary behaviorists are saying now. Things like fidelity and recognition of authority and fairness and compassion and purity. That these are all things that we actually somehow they're innate in us. Societies that succeed were able to share those types of values.
Maslow in 1948 wrote the hierarchy of
Right,
needs,
but
which
this actually makes it, this disagrees with Maslow in that. So we become social people, and societies socialize their communities. So if you think that a significant portion of our country is refusing to get vaccinated in the name of freedom, right? In the name of freedom, you can understand why the idea that all young people should have an opportunity to serve their country isn't going to work. And that even the conversation about civics is what's being battled now in boards of education across the country, right? That to say local communities should determine their curriculum, I have to tell you, what they're learning isn't what I would want my kids to be learning. So it's complicated in a country like America, which is so decentralized, to think about creating national purpose as we did, for example, in World War II, or as we did even for that brief moment after the murder of George Floyd. There was that brief moment when people could actually join together and say something's wrong. But of course, that didn't last very long. Yet we're a complicated country that way. In some ways, it is harder in America to think about a shared ethos than it is in countries, and it could be unfortunate, like Poland, where the majority of the country, they're white, they're Catholic, they can disagree on something, but they kind of share that identity. We're Sweden, we're Denmark, right? We're more complicated. We're more complicated.
How did you broker a understanding between the Latter-day Saints baptizing ancestors and a Jewish community who I assume didn't want their ancestors baptized?
You mean that they were using Holocaust lists of people murdered in concentration camps and posthumously baptizing them? Well, first off, I'm going to be honest. I'm a very talented mediator. It took work, again, not dissimilar to what I'm saying, creating some modesty on both sides. Modesty on the Jewish side to understand this is deep in the faith of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Mormons believe and understand this means something. It's a gift that they're offering posthumous baptism. So the Jewish community had to come to grips with that. The Church of the president said you can no longer say more than you have to say the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The LDS Church had to understand the deep pain of what it means for someone whose child was murdered in Auschwitz to see that child's name come up. There's not even a burial place for that child, but that name comes up on a list in Salt Lake City. And so it created empathetic understanding. I would tell you in the South, speaking about LGBTQ rights, similarly, empathetic understanding. It doesn't have to be agreement, but empathetic understanding. And we have to have an empathetic understanding as well. What does it feel? What is it like to feel that your world is being trashed? That you have no respect for you? What is it like? As I said, I could listen, record, respond empathetically. That didn't stop me from politically fighting tooth and nail against that. But that's different from understanding. I think we've become incredibly rigid. All of us have become incredibly rigid. That if I also did mediation between Israeli Jews Palestinians, right? And what became clear was to even listen to the other's story was a form of blasphemy, was heresy, be a heretic, to even listen to the other side. And that is also the end of democracy. So I'd like to think that what I was able to do in that circumstance was at least get people to listen to each other. And there we could come up actually with some solutions. It's not the only place that that's happened.
What was the solution?
The solution was that if you are LDS, the Church of Latter-day Saints, and you have Jewish ancestors, right, then you can possibly baptize them. But you cannot use, they had to create an algorithm that would catch people coming off of lists, Holocaust lists, and they agreed that that was inappropriate. And it's worked. I'm very popular in Salt Lake City.
Back.
I first want to say thank you. I walked into this event by accident and I was going to say hi and I ended up staying. I could not resist. This is so intellectually stimulating.
I'm sorry, what is your name?
Lisa.
Lisa, hi, thank you.
Especially I was trying to study Kabbalah in Los Angeles for several level, the Jewish mysticism. I enjoy Michael I was in India and then it's fascinated about Yogananda and also still trying to process what I saw there. But growing up, the goddess of mercy, and it makes me think, like you said, social order. You know, there's a one creator we are fighting over who has the best relationship that way. And there's always a division. And my question is, democracy not only among people of color, different religion, different country, what about democracy between male and female? The balance of two energy, because I do notice most of our spiritual religious leaders are men, and the biology is different, the women biology is different, the is different. Do you think we should even consider looking at the goddess of this world, like from Ireland, and who defined who are the God and the male form, and the only son of God is Jesus, who is the only daughter of Jesus, God. I mean, I was asked, and I travel about our religion in America.
Yeah.
So I go, oh yeah, the whole Asia, maybe Africa, other countries don't have the same versions to the God versus goddesses. And are we human beings having a spiritual experience, or are we really spiritual beings having an experience? And all this is just like.
So I have a confession. My wife is a rabbi. Right? So I'm the one who does the cooking. I check on who's sick in the congregation. So I do have a confession to make that I have lived, my wife's been a rabbi for 40 years, very much in a world in which God is not male. Certainly, there's no question that historically, this triumvirate of king, monarch, general, and church leader, that was dominant, right? So the conquest of America, the Americas. I was at a conference in the Vatican about conversion, and it turned out what the Catholics and the World Council of Churches was upset about was that their missionaries in Africa and Asia were getting attacked. It was true. In Indonesia, missionaries were burnt and they were killed in Africa. And it was very upsetting. I said, well, I want you to step back from it and do understand, in the name of Jesus, you conquered and decimated these countries and colonized them. There just may be some animosity there that you have to consider as at least a possibility. So, yeah, yes, but there's a but. I'm going to go back to my pragmatic claim. Do I use gendered language when I talk about faith? No, I don't at all. Do I recognize that if I'm going to be convincing in the political world, I cannot tell other people how they should believe, how they should understand God's presence in the world, or no God in the world, or goddesses in the world. I can't do that. I have to deal with people. There's a great biblical line, in the book of Genesis, where a really crummy story, Abraham, the progenitor of the Jews, Christians, Muslims, father, pushes his concubine wife out with their child into the desert to die. The child is dry and dying of thirst. And the mother moves away from him because it's so painful. And an angel comes to him. And it says, the text says that the angel God heard this child where that child was. It's really interesting, like what is it? So the tradition that came out of that was that it's not about what you want to teach, it's what about the learner is going to learn. So as a teacher, it's not about me. I've got to understand what needs to be learned. So to certain communities, what you're saying is beautiful and could be inspiring and compelling. To other communities, it's blasphemy to not, I was in Ethiopia and I was in a church, an incredible church event in the underground churches in Ethiopia. And in the center is the Holy of Holies. And they allowed me to go and look. And there in the center of the Holy of Holies, in this African church, was a picture of Jesus with long blonde hair, right, and blue eyes, right? But I've got to be able to talk to people where they are, not where I want them to be. So I would say yes, as I would say to you, yes, but, and the but is, I've got to listen carefully and respond in their language. I still am not going to use degendered language in talking about God in a church in Vidalia, Georgia, or Knoxville, Tennessee, but I certainly am going to have to speak in their language so that we can be in communication.
This is a bit of a tangent, but when you talked about White Jesus, it reminded me of one of the greatest episodes of sitcom television. Why am I suddenly blanking? But the episode with Black Jesus, JJ, what was the show? Mom was in Florida. Oh my gosh, this is embarrassing. This is so embarrassing.
The
Oh,
little cartoon.
Dynamite. What?
Oh,
Oh.
Dynamite.
Why have I drawn a blank? Because it's not relevant to this program. It was Florida was Maud's maid, and the spinoff was about her family, and her husband was played by John Amos. The son JJ, Jimmy Walker. I know you know this, but we've all blanked out. There is a collective.
I'm not a great TV. Is this old? It's like an old.
From the 70s, but there was a whole episode about Black Jesus, and their son Michael, I believe, had painted a Black Jesus, and he suddenly got all this luck. And Florida, the mother, was like, "How dare you? That's not Jesus." Sorry, I'm so sorry, y'all. Okay, on that note, we're coming back. We'll take 2 more questions. Go ahead.
I was wondering.
What did you need?
Dave.
Dave. Nice name.
What your thoughts were on misinformation and faith communities, and whether faith communities play a part in countering misinformation, just as a source of community and authentic information, or if they perpetuate it.
Yeah, look, the signs of the deterioration of democracy, that's one of them. But I'm going to tell you a funny thing. I was trained in deconstructionist theory, continental theory, in which there is no truth. We all speak from our own place, and we have to accept the narratives or alternative narratives like it's turned on us. What we saw it being as ridding the oppression the sole, power answer, the Foucault's, right, critique of power has flipped on us, saying, you've got your views, I've got my views. You've got your truth, I've got my truths. You're no more authentic than I am. Americans are remarkable that way. Years ago, there was a assessment of math skills, and of 20 countries. The United States came in last in every category but one. In the category when they asked, are you good in math, we scored number 1. Right? So that's a fundamental problem we have now. And I don't know, I have no answer to that other than to say that, yes, faith communities do value truth. And it would be wonderful for them to speak. And there are religious leaders who are doing that. But it's one of the areas of danger for us. The other areas of danger are defamation. It's an interesting libel case coming to the Supreme Court on issues of can you challenge, threaten somebody who's defamed you, who's a public figure, which is now protected, wouldn't be protected. I don't know, that's assaults on individuals, physical assaults on individuals, right? Undermining the institutions of democracy themselves, fair elections. There's a whole array of ways in which our institutions are under threat right now. That's one of them. Literally, I don't know. As we know, I'm telling you all stuff which is, I actually go to Fox News because I do need to understand, again, I need to hear and understand other voices. But on the whole, Americans, the percentage is so massive of only hearing certain voices, and the algorithms only promote those certain voices. And I don't know how to get around, I don't know how we're going to get around that. As I said, I don't want to be depressing, but the question really is, can liberal democracy as we understood it withstand the range of assaults on it right now? And that is one prime area of assault, and I don't know what the solution is.
So I do apologize. I got a note from our operations manager. I didn't realize, even with this big watch, was so engrossed in the conversation, I did not realize the lateness of the hour. So, and the show was good times. He sends all the messages to me. But what I will say kind of as we close, with regard to that question about what are you hopeful about? I have to admit, hearing you talking about these communities that you were able to go into and actually that they were even receptive to conversation, that is something to hold on to. So that's the nugget. That's the nugget we're all walking out with. We've got some little spaces where we can go. But on behalf of everyone here and Manny's, Professor Elcott, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause. In the meantime, he is available. The table is set in the back. If you would like to purchase a copy of his book, I highly recommend it. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Take care. It's funny, I had two on my notes and didn't need them. So remember that.
We talk about that strange phenomenon.
The Baptists. Very different.
They are given the role of Christianity, their oppression.
It is really blinding at times, and you're right. You cannot have a conversation.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. That's like a great experience you had in your learning. You had a great experience.
I did. But it-
Some of you